Welcome, dearly beloved anointed ones. When they can't find dirt on you, they start throwing dust and praying people choke on it. Let that marinate for a moment, because that's exactly what happened to you, chosen one. And the most chilling part? They almost succeeded, with zero proof, zero facts, and zero shame. Fact: according to psychology, false accusations are more emotionally damaging than actual physical trauma. Why? Because they don't just hurt your name, they try to erase your entire identity. And these people weren't just trying to slander you, they were trying to spiritually assassinate you. Not because you wronged them, but because you represented everything they're not: integrity, resilience, divine favor. You see, when you're chosen, you become a mirror people didn't ask for. And insecure souls can't stand their reflection, so they break the mirror instead of fixing the image. What makes it even wilder? They launched a full-blown smear campaign with less evidence than a conspiracy theory subreddit, and just as much drama. Some of them acted like they were solving a true crime podcast. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Let's Destroy Someone Who Did Nothing Wrong. Today's guest? The chosen one, who dared to mind their business and glow in peace. But here's the twist. What they meant for your cancellation became your confirmation. And now that the dust is clearing, everyone's shocked at just how far they were willing to go to take you out, without a shred of evidence to back it up. So sit tight. Because what we're about to unpack will make you angry, make you laugh, and most of all, make you see the divine setup in the sabotage. Let's get into it. Number one, they fabricated a crime scene around your existence. They didn't just dislike you, they orchestrated a whole narrative to make people question your very identity. And the wild part is, there wasn't a single thing they could point to and say, that's where they went wrong. So instead they created a crime scene around your existence. Not because you did something criminal, but because your presence alone challenged everything fake about theirs. You were the living contradiction to their gossip, their performance, their two-faced lives, and that was threatening. So they twisted the story. They couldn't call you loud, so they called you cold. They couldn't say you were dishonest, so they said you were too private. They couldn't prove you were dangerous, so they started calling you off or hard to read. See how that works? When people have no real evidence, they start using language that's vague enough to sound deep, but shallow enough to fool the lazy-minded. And sadly, lazy minds are everywhere. They treated your character like a blank canvas and painted it with the mess of their own projections. They didn't have facts, so they filled in the gaps with fiction. All because the truth, that you were genuine, consistent, and unbothered, was too hard for them to swallow. You became a walking contradiction to their mess. And instead of learning from you, they tried to label you. They threw dirt on your name, not because you were dirty, but because they knew your name was too clean for their comfort. And here's the kicker. The people watching all this unfold didn't even stop to ask for proof. They just went along with the noise. Because when a lie is repeated enough times by enough people, it starts to sound like truth, until the truth walks in and ruins everything. You didn't have to defend yourself. Life did it for you, because every accusation they threw had no weight. And the more they tried to frame you, the more they framed themselves. Their obsession was the confession. The harder they pushed the narrative, the more obvious it became that you were never the issue. They were just desperate to make you one. And now that the dust is settling, people are finally seeing it. You weren't the suspect, you were the target. And they're realizing how far those people went just to tear down someone who never even threw a punch. Number two, their accusations were built on emotion, not evidence. They didn't come at you with facts. They came at you with feelings, ugly, insecure, jealous feelings, and dressed them up like evidence. That's the truth nobody wants to admit. They weren't reacting to something you did. They were reacting to how your presence made them feel about themselves. That's what triggered them. You didn't harm them. You just reminded them of everything they hadn't become. And instead of being honest about that, they went into survival mode, attacked the one who exposes the lie by simply existing in truth. You didn't walk around bragging. You weren't confrontational. You didn't compete, but still you were the one they circled like prey. Why? Because there's a type of person who sees your confidence and assumes it's a threat. There's a type who sees your peace and takes it personally, so they start creating stories, not because those stories are true, but because they feel true to them, and in their mind, that's all they need. Their emotional discomfort becomes their moral compass, and suddenly you're the villain in their fantasy. They never pause to ask themselves why you bothered them so much. They didn't reflect, they projected, and that projection turned into obsession. They'd say things like, "I just don't trust them," or "something about them feels off," but could never give specifics. Why? Because it was never about you. It was about their emotional reaction to your light. And instead of owning that, they twisted it into an accusation. What's wild is how many people bought into it too. People love a good drama, especially when it comes with gossip. No one asked for receipts, no one questioned the motive. They just ran with it because it's easier to follow the crowd than to think critically. So now you had a whole group of people side-eyeing you based on nothing but someone else's emotional meltdown. But here's the catch: emotions don't age well. Over time, the truth has a way of outlasting all the noise. And now those same people who pointed fingers are realizing something doesn't add up. Because when the dust settles, people start asking questions. And the biggest one is, if you were really so dangerous, why has nothing ever stuck? The answer's simple. They weren't reacting to truth. They were reacting to their own reflection. Number 3, you triggered their guilt simply by surviving with integrity. You didn't expose them with your words. You exposed them just by continuing to exist without turning bitter. That's what really got under their skin. They thought they could break you, and when you didn't break, they got offended. You didn't seek revenge, you didn't play their game, and that made them feel even smaller. Your peace started to sound like judgment to people who knew they had done you wrong. Your healing became a mirror they never asked for, and the guilt they tried to bury started rising every time your name was mentioned. What people don't talk about enough is how threatening it is to be okay after people tried to destroy you. There's something about your quiet survival that messes with their head. They expect you to be bitter, angry, ruined. When you're not, it exposes something twisted in their own spirit, because deep down they know the truth. If the roles were reversed, they wouldn't have survived what they put you through. That's why they try to flip the story. They'll say you're acting brand new, or thinking you're better than everybody, when in reality, you're just not playing broken anymore. The problem is they got comfortable with the idea of you being the underdog. They liked the version of you that was doubting yourself, walking on eggshells, questioning your worth. That version made them feel superior. But now they're watching you glow without their approval, and it's eating them alive. And let's be honest, if you had fought back the way they expected, they would have used that as the excuse to paint you as crazy, aggressive, or unstable. But you didn't. You stood tall. You healed in silence. You upgraded. You moved on. That restraint, that maturity, that was the final blow, because it left them with no ammo and a whole lot of guilt. They wanted you to crumble, but you evolved. And your evolution was the one thing they weren't prepared for. They were banking on your collapse to justify their actions. But your peace said more than their lies ever could. Now they're stuck watching someone they tried to bury bloom right in front of them, and they're choking on the guilt they never thought they'd have to face. Number 4, they studied you like a suspect, yet found nothing but strength. They watched you like a hawk, not out of admiration, but out of obsession. They waited for you to mess up, to slip, to show any sign that the strength you carried was fake. They studied your every move, your words, your silence, your reactions, hoping to find something they could twist and use as proof that you weren't who you appeared to be. But no matter how close they looked, all they found was consistency. You didn't falter the way they predicted. You didn't lash out, self-destruct, or expose some hidden flaw. All they saw was quiet resilience and an unshakable sense of self, and that drove them mad. They weren't studying you to understand you. They were studying you to break you. But how do you break someone whose strength is rooted in something deeper than ego? How do you sabotage someone who has already survived worse than anything you can throw at them? You were too grounded, too anchored in your purpose, and too centered in your truth. That's why their attacks fell flat. But instead of admitting that maybe they had misjudged you, they did what insecure people do when the truth doesn't line up with their agenda. They made things up. They started painting you as too perfect, too polished, too quiet, as if those were crimes. Because when people can't find flaws in your character, they start inventing flaws in your intentions. They begin saying things like, there's something off about them, or they're hiding something. Not because you actually are, but because they can't accept that you're real. They couldn't handle the fact that everything they threw at you bounced off. So they decided to build a case against you without evidence, just vibes, envy, and projection. They manufactured guilt in places where only grace lived. They searched your past for skeletons, but found survival stories. They dug into your personality and only uncovered layers of strength, and that made them furious. You were never the fraud. They were just hoping you would be. Because if someone like you can be genuine, disciplined, and at peace, what does that say about the excuses they've been living behind? So they kept watching, kept talking, kept accusing, and all they found was truth they couldn't unsee. Number 5, they built a case with hearsay and hysteria, not truth. They didn't build a case. They built chaos and called it evidence. All it took was one person with an issue, and suddenly every grudge, every misunderstanding, every old rumor became proof of who you supposedly were. There was no truth, just a mess of opinions wrapped in emotion. They didn't gather facts, they gathered gossip. And because the gossip confirmed what they wanted to believe, they ran with it like it was law. They made whispers sound like witness statements. Someone said something vague, and before you knew it, it turned into an entire narrative. No one ever paused to ask, did this really happen, or is there any proof? Instead, they just kept repeating each other. One person lied, another repeated it, and the next one swore they heard the same thing. That's not truth. That's groupthink. And groupthink is dangerous when the goal is to tear someone down. Jealousy was dressed up as justice. They weren't fighting for right or wrong. They were fighting for comfort. Your elevation made them uncomfortable. Your peace made them feel unsettled. So to make themselves feel better, they decided you must be hiding something. They created an illusion that you had done something terrible, all because they couldn't understand how you were still standing with so much grace and strength. There was no trial, there was no defense, just conclusions based on vibes and volume. They made themselves judge, jury, and executioner, and sentenced you based on how they felt, not what they knew. The scariest part, people believed it, not because it made sense, but because it was said with confidence and drama. In a world obsessed with narratives, the loudest one often wins, even when it's false. They didn't want to know the real you. They wanted to believe you were as flawed as they felt. That way they wouldn't have to change or confront their own emptiness, so they crafted a version of you that made their insecurities feel justified, but now the cracks in that case are showing. Because the truth has a habit of surviving longer than the noise. And every time you keep showing up, shining, evolving, they're forced to realize that the entire case against you was built on nothing but air. Number 6, the real threat wasn't what you did. It was what you could become. They didn't come for you because of something you did. They came for you because of what they sensed you were becoming. Even when you hadn't fully tapped into your power yet, they felt it rising. They saw the early signs, the way you carried yourself, the way people naturally gravitated toward you, the way your presence shifted the energy in the room. You weren't even trying, and still you unsettled them. That alone told them everything they needed to know. You were going to outgrow them, outshine them, and possibly even expose them without saying a word. It wasn't about your past. Most of them didn't even know the full story of where you came from. They weren't reacting to your history. They were panicking over your destiny. There was something in you they couldn't explain, but they knew it would one day outmatch everything they built on ego, manipulation, and control. And that terrified them, because they knew that once you truly stepped into who you were, they wouldn't be able to contain, influence, or compete with you. So they tried to clip your wings before you learned you could fly. They isolated you, mocked you, lied on you, and tried to convince others you were dangerous, difficult, or unstable, all before you had even discovered your full value. They treated you like a threat while you were still figuring things out, which shows how deeply they feared what would happen once you stopped doubting yourself. It wasn't about your actions, it was about your essence. They weren't just trying to stop you. They were trying to beat time itself. Because they knew something big was coming for you, and they were racing against it. Their attacks weren't logical, they were desperate. That's why the betrayal felt so personal. They weren't responding to who you were at that moment. They were reacting to the future version of you they couldn't handle. And here's the kicker. They weren't wrong. You were a threat. Not because you were dangerous, but because you were destined. They sensed that you were chosen for something higher. And their attempts to destroy you before you bloomed just confirmed how accurate their fear really was. You were a disruption to everything fake they built, and they were right to panic. Number 7, they weaponized your pain and called it proof. They watched you break, and instead of helping, they recorded it like a scene for their script. When you cried, they called it unstable. When you shut down, they called it antisocial. When you withdrew to protect your peace, they called it suspicious. All along, they were the ones causing the wounds, but they made your reaction to the pain their proof that you were the problem. They never told the full story. They never mentioned how many times they gaslit you, isolated you, lied to your face, or betrayed your trust. That part got left out. But when you started showing signs of emotional exhaustion, they used it as fuel. They didn't care about what you were going through. They just needed something that could justify the hate they had already decided to throw at you. And your trauma, raw, unprocessed, and visible, became the evidence they needed for their made-up case. They saw you bleeding, and instead of asking what happened, they stood over you and said, "See, we told you they were weak." But no one asked who held the knife. No one questioned the story behind the scars, because it was easier to call you broken than to admit they were the ones who broke you. They used your pain as propaganda. They studied your lowest moments and turned them into character flaws, not because you were flawed, but because they couldn't stand the truth. Even in your worst state, you were still more real than anything they pretended to be. That's why your struggle made them so uncomfortable. It reminded them that your strength came from survival, not performance. And the most twisted part, they didn't just point to your pain, they needed it. Your trauma became their excuse to keep you in a box. As long as you stayed quiet, sad, or unsure, they could keep feeling superior. But once you began to heal, once you started standing up straighter, smiling again, finding your voice, they panicked. Because healed you ruins their whole narrative. You weren't unstable, you were injured. And what they used as proof was really a trail of evidence that they had no idea how much damage they'd done. But your healing now speaks louder than their spin ever could. And deep down, they know it. Number 8, their obsession was the evidence of their guilt. They couldn't stop talking about you. You lived rent-free in their minds, and not because you were chasing attention, but because your existence disturbed something deep inside them. You didn't have to post about them, mention their names, or clap back. Still, they watched your every move, monitored your growth, picked apart your silence, and exaggerated your missteps. Their obsession wasn't random, it was their guilt bubbling to the surface. They knew what they did, they knew how they moved behind closed doors, and the louder your life started to speak through peace, purpose, and elevation, the more exposed they felt. So they went on the offensive. They kept your name in rotation, not because you did something wrong, but because they were hoping the noise would drown out their own conscience. Every warning they gave others about you was a reflection of what they feared being revealed about themselves. Every attempt to tear down your reputation was an effort to distract from the truth they were desperate to hide. They weren't trying to protect people from you. They were trying to protect themselves from being held accountable, and it was obvious. You didn't seek revenge, yet they acted like you were out to destroy them. You stayed quiet, yet they claimed you were manipulating everyone. You stayed focused, yet they accused you of being calculated. Why? Because your stability made their actions look reckless, your healing made their behavior look sick, and your progress made their sabotage look pathetic. That's why they kept obsessing. They were stuck in a loop, constantly trying to convince people you were the issue, when the real issue was how guilty they felt around your grace. Their hatred was a cover-up. Their fixation was a cry for help. They needed people to believe you were dangerous, because if anyone looked too closely, the truth would come out, and it would point right back at them. You never had to prove anything. The way they couldn't leave you alone was the proof. They couldn't stop watching because they knew deep down they were wrong. And now, the more they talk, the more they tell on themselves. Their obsession wasn't power, it was panic. It still is. Number 9, they wanted you gone. Because your innocence was inconvenient. Your innocence wasn't just misunderstood, it was offensive, it was a problem. Not because you did anything to anyone, but because you didn't join them in their games. You didn't bend the truth to fit in. You didn't play politics. You didn't stoop to petty manipulation just to survive. And that made you a threat, not to their safety, but to their systems. Because everything about you revealed what they were trying to hide. They weren't looking for someone honest, they were looking for someone controllable. And you couldn't be bought, bullied, or guilt-tripped into becoming something you weren't. You didn't participate in their drama. You didn't water yourself down just to be liked. You kept showing up as you, clear, grounded, and honest. And that made them uncomfortable because your truth started shaking their lies like an earthquake. In a space where backstabbing was the norm, your loyalty looked suspicious. Where fake smiling and hidden agendas were expected, your transparency made people uneasy. It's twisted, but in some circles, being real is seen as rebellious. That's why your presence disrupted everything. You didn't have to expose anyone. Your character was the exposure. And that's when the campaign started. They didn't want you gone because you were dangerous. They wanted you gone because your existence made their lies harder to keep up. You walked into rooms and shifted the atmosphere without saying a word. And instead of rising to meet your energy, they chose to try and erase it, because if you stayed visible, people would eventually notice the contrast, and the contrast would make them look bad. So they did what cowards do when they can't match your integrity. They tried to cancel you. They spread stories, isolated you, twisted your motives, all in hopes that people would reject you before they could see you clearly. But what they didn't realize is this: innocence doesn't need a defense team. It speaks for itself. It may not be loud, but it lasts. They couldn't cleanse their hands, so they tried to stain yours. But no matter how hard they pushed, your consistency kept shining through. And now, the same purity they once tried to destroy is the very thing people are beginning to respect, because even in a world that rewards manipulation, real will always outlast fake. Number 10. They were desperate to destroy you before people saw the truth. They weren't just out to ruin your name, they were racing against time. The panic wasn't about who you were in the present, it was about who you were becoming and how quickly you were getting there. They saw it coming. The way you were evolving, the way people were starting to notice your energy, your wisdom, your strength. It scared them. Not because you were doing anything wrong, but because the truth about you was starting to become visible, undeniable, and impossible to twist. So they launched the attack early, before people could ask deeper questions, before your actions could speak louder than their lies. They didn't wait for evidence, because evidence would have betrayed their agenda. They tried to kill the truth in its infancy because they knew they couldn't stop it once it matured. You were becoming the proof that everything they said was a lie, and they couldn't risk letting people see that. It's why they moved so fast. The gossip didn't start randomly. It was calculated. It was designed to stain your image before your light got too bright. Because once people saw you for who you really were, they'd start questioning the people who tried to ruin you. And those questions would expose a whole network of jealousy, insecurity, and manipulation. So their only hope was to poison the well before anyone got a clean drink. They needed the lie to spread faster than the truth. That's why they were so loud. That's why they got others involved. That's why they exaggerated every detail and spun every story. Not because the lie made sense, but because they were desperate to be believed before people found out the truth for themselves. But here's the beautiful part. The truth doesn't operate on panic. It doesn't need to rush or scream. It just waits. And now, as time has passed, your character is doing the quiet work. People are starting to see the inconsistencies in the stories. They're realizing that the ones who screamed the loudest are the ones who had the most to hide. And the panic hasn't stopped. If anything, it's getting worse, because despite all their efforts, your truth is still spreading, still shining, still cutting through the noise. And the one thing they feared most, being exposed, is unfolding right before their eyes. Number 11. You were a threat without even trying. That's what scared them most. You didn't compete with them, but they competed with you. You weren't trying to impress anyone, but your presence made them feel like they had to prove something. You weren't chasing clout, validation, or a seat at their table, and that's what made you dangerous in their eyes. Because you moved like someone who already knew their worth, and people who rely on control can't stand those who don't need their approval. They couldn't figure you out, and that bothered them. You weren't playing the same game. While they were busy strategizing how to be seen, you were focused on being solid. You weren't performing, you were just being. And what you were being, whole, grounded, authentic, was so unfamiliar to them, it felt like a threat. Not because you harmed them, but because you revealed the emptiness of everything they thought made them powerful. You didn't need to manipulate to get attention. You didn't have to lie to gain influence. You didn't step on others to rise. You just kept evolving, quietly, intentionally, and with a kind of peace that couldn't be bought. And they didn't know how to handle that, because everything they built was based on appearances, on noise, on control. You came with presence, and that shook them. Your calm exposed their chaos. Your confidence revealed their insecurity. Your silence carried more weight than all their gossip combined. And that imbalance made them feel powerless. They couldn't argue with you because you weren't interested in drama. They couldn't bait you because you weren't emotionally available to be manipulated. So the only thing left for them to do was try to erase you. They whispered behind your back. They spread doubt before anyone could ask questions. They tried to turn others against you before your light reached them. Because deep down they knew the moment people really saw you, it would be over. The illusion of their power couldn't survive next to your truth. So they tried to bury you in silence before your presence could speak for itself. But here you are, still present, still powerful, still becoming everything they feared. And the truth is, they weren't scared of what you did. They were scared of what you didn't have to do to be exactly what they wished they were. Number 12, the smear campaign was their confession in disguise. They thought they were covering their tracks, but every lie they told about you was actually a breadcrumb trail leading straight back to them. The smear campaign wasn't just an attack, it was a confession. With every rumor, every accusation, every dramatic story, they were leaking their own secrets without realizing it. Because when people lie like that, boldly, consistently, and without real provocation, it's never just about the target. It's about protecting something they don't want anyone to see. You weren't the danger. You were just the mirror. And that's what made them spiral. You saw too much. Maybe you didn't say anything, but your presence alone revealed the gap between who they pretended to be and who they really were. That's why the attacks felt so personal. It wasn't just that they didn't like you. It was that they feared you might accidentally tell the truth, or worse, let your life tell it. So they flipped it. They turned their own guilt into accusations and made you the scapegoat. But here's the thing. Lies built from fear always sound a little too detailed, a little too emotional, a little too desperate. The more they accused you, the more they exposed themselves. The stories got more elaborate, but the evidence never showed up. The claims got more dramatic, but your actions never matched the energy. And that's what made people start to question things. At first, they might have believed it. People love drama. But over time, people started to notice the contradictions. They started to ask, if this person is really that bad, why are they still standing? Why does their energy not match what we were told? Why does it seem like the ones pointing fingers are the ones unraveling? The smear campaign backfired because it wasn't built on truth. It was built on projection. And projection always folds under the weight of consistency. You didn't have to clap back. You didn't need a PR team. You just kept showing up as yourself. Calm, steady, real. And now the mask is slipping. The people who screamed the loudest are starting to look exposed because the lies they told about you are starting to look more and more like reflections of themselves. Number 13, they didn't need evidence. They just needed agreement. They didn't come with proof. They came with people. People who already didn't like you, not because of anything you did, but because your presence reminded them of everything they weren't. It wasn't about truth, it was about numbers. They weren't building a case, they were building a crowd. A noisy, bitter crowd that echoed each other's hate like it was gospel. No one asked for facts, no one questioned the motive. As long as enough people nodded, it became the new truth. It was never justice, they just wanted company in their misery. They linked arms with others who resented your peace, your discipline, your favor. They found common ground in the fact that they couldn't figure you out, couldn't shake you, couldn't stop you from shining. So they turned their frustration into a movement, not based on reason, but on resentment. It wasn't truth they were chasing, it was comfort. And nothing comforts a guilty conscience like finding others who agree with your lie. They needed validation, not clarity, so they went where confirmation bias lives, gossip, cliques, and group chats full of people who already had a problem with your light. They didn't examine you, they judged you through the lens of their own insecurity. They didn't discuss events, they exaggerated them. And instead of holding each other accountable, they clapped and nodded and passed the mic to the next hater. It wasn't a trial, it was a parade. And while they were busy trying to turn the crowd against you, they forgot one thing. Agreement doesn't equal truth. You didn't fight them. You didn't defend yourself with the same energy. You just stayed planted. You let your consistency be your advocate. And over time, people started to notice the difference between what was said about you and who you actually are. Now the dust is clearing and the alliances they built are falling apart. Because once the drama dies down and the emotions fade, all that's left is reality. And reality is showing them that their spiritual ambush didn't destroy you, it exposed them. They came for your crown without understanding your covering. And now, the same people they rallied are starting to quietly back away, realizing they were just foot soldiers in a battle fueled by jealousy, not justice. Number 14, they fought dirty because you shine clean. They knew from the start they couldn't beat you on character, on consistency, or on purpose. So they got grimy. They resorted to underhanded tactics, spread lies behind your back, set traps in your path, tried to isolate you from the people who genuinely cared. They twisted your words, questioned your intentions, and did everything they could to dirty your name. Not because you deserved it, but because they couldn't compete with how naturally you carried what they had to fake. They tried to bait you into responding. They wanted you to stoop to their level, to defend yourself in ways that would make you look just as messy. But you didn't take the bait. You knew who you were. You knew what they were doing. And instead of getting revenge, you chose elevation. You kept rising quietly, powerfully, with grace. And every time you refused to fight dirty, it chipped away at their strategy, because the only way they could justify their hate was if you gave them something to point to, and you never did. You didn't play their game. You walked away from the board. You let your actions speak. You kept your energy clean, your hands steady, your focus forward, and while they were busy launching spiritual attacks and stirring up drama, you were healing, learning, glowing up. You didn't match their chaos with more chaos, you responded with evolution, and that's the part they can't handle. Your glow came from the fire they tried to burn you with. Your strength was shaped in the same storms they hoped would destroy you. You came out of it all without bitterness, without scandal, without needing to expose them. And that silence, that maturity, that glow, they can't stand it. Because it proves everything they tried to convince others wasn't true about you. Now they're unraveling, not because you did anything to them, but because their entire identity was built around trying to take you down. And you refused to be touched. You were the storm they couldn't predict, the light they couldn't dim, the truth they couldn't silence. They fought dirty because they had no other option. And it's killing them slowly that you didn't even have to lift a finger to win. You just stayed clean. And that right there was the final blow. They built lies like walls, gathered haters like soldiers, and launched attacks like arrows. Yet here you are, standing, unbothered, elevated. Every move they made to destroy you only confirmed how powerful you truly are, because you never had to fight dirty. You never had to manipulate, beg, or defend yourself through drama. You just kept showing up with truth in your eyes, strength in your spirit, and purpose in your steps. That alone dismantled everything they tried to build against you. They were loud. You were consistent. They spread chaos. You embodied peace. They relied on groupthink. You relied on divine alignment. And now the dust has cleared, and the same people who once whispered behind your back are starting to question everything they were told. Why? Because nothing adds up except your glow, your growth, and your grace. What they called proof was really projection. What they labeled as weakness was actually resilience. And what they tried to cancel was something heaven already confirmed. So let this be the closure they never gave you. You were never guilty. You were never the problem. You were just the mirror. And when people can't handle their own reflection, they try to shatter the glass. But glass cuts back. Let them deal with the consequences of their own hands. You? Keep evolving. Keep rising. Keep glowing clean in a dirty world. because the truth is finally louder than the lies, and your victory is already making more noise than their smear campaign ever could. If this message hit home for you, don't just scroll past. Show some love. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another truth-packed word that speaks to your soul. Like this video to push it into the hands of someone else who needs it right now. Comment below and let us know how this resonated with your journey. We read every word. And share this with someone who's been silently battling lies, false accusations, or spiritual warfare. Let them know. They're not crazy, they're chosen. This community is about truth, healing, and undeniable elevation. So, don't just watch from the sidelines. Join the movement. Hit that bell icon too, because every time we drop, it's deeper than motivation. It's spiritual confirmation. Let's keep rising together. God bless you.